History is full of amazing stories and memorable people.
But we don't care about them.
No hits, deep tracks only.
Some of the most influential people in the world have been completely overlooked or just plain forgotten.
We're digging deep into the history books to bring you their stories.
And maybe some laughs along the way.
This is History's B-Side.
Today's B-Sider is the forgotten hero of the Watergate scandal.
So when I was, researching to find this week's topic, I was kind of struck when I found our B-Sider for today, mostly because of the way he kind of epitomizes the idea I think we had when we started our podcast. We wanted to find these people that were present and influential during these big, events in history, but who weren't given the credit and didn't have their stories properly told, or just weren't well known because of their place during these events. And
right, this is probably one of those things that most Americans have heard of Watergate, but they maybe don't know all the details on it. But also, we wanted these moments where it's some huge part of history, like a story that you can't skip over when you're telling history, American history or whatever, but that there's people there that, were integral to the story itself, but you maybe not have heard of, even if you do know the story very well.
Totally. And I think one of the other striking things is that he's the B-Sider for today was not only forgotten to the main populace, who just has this really shallow, I think, understanding of the Watergate scandal, as I do, of course. But he's also
Guilty.
kind of, not after this week, but it's interesting how left behind he is among people who produced works about Watergate and who studied Watergate and people who should know every person's name.
When you told me this was your topic this week, I tried to do a little research myself, not extensively like you did, but just enough that I would be able to comment on it. And even reading the stories, they mentioned the story of this guy, but even his name didn't come up too often. So he's the classic example of someone that just is forgotten about in the history retelling of such a big moment.
Yeah. It was kind of striking to me how little information there was, even on pretty in-depth documents and articles about Watergate. So without further ado, today we're going to be talking about a gentleman by the name of Frank Wills, who was the on-duty security guard at the Watergate office building the night that the Watergate break-in and burglary was committed. And that's kind of the event that started the entire scandal and cover-up that became a huge part of American politics and history. But before we get into his story or the actual events of Watergate, I wanted to start by kind of setting the stage with a little bit of information about President Nixon.
That's probably the name that's most synonymous with Watergate. People automatically think Nixon.
Yeah, absolutely. So Richard Nixon, at the time of his election, had been a prominent Republican representative and senator. He was from California, and he previously had served as the 36th vice president under Dwight D. Eisenhower from 1953 to 1961. And then he would go on to lose a presidential election to John F. Kennedy in 1960, after which 9 years later, he would win his first term as the 37th president of the United States. He was an interesting figure, and I find that I myself am usually surprised repeatedly when I read about politics at this time, just because they are kind of starkly different than what I think we're used to, especially today. And just for context purposes, we should note that we're recording this on January 19th of 2021, which is the last evening of Donald Trump's presidency. And you'll notice a little bit of analogous material, I suppose, crossover here in themes.
You mean corruption and scandal in the White House?
I didn't say anything about that. But yes. So Richard Nixon, despite being a really popular figure within the Republican Party at the time,
Trump, also a popular figure in the Republican Party at the time.
It's already starting. Even after his resignation, though, he remained a conservative figure for many of the more right-leaning conservatives. I actually recently watched a Netflix documentary about Roger Stone, which was one of the campaign advisors for Trump, and this huge, kind of corrupt right-wing political activist. I don't even want to call him an activist. He's just this kind of character. I don't know. You should look it up. It's called Get Me Roger Stone.
You used to wear glasses that kind of remind me of Roger Stone.
Oh God, that's not good. But he actually has a tattoo of Richard Nixon's face right below his neck on his back.
That's like not surprising, but I mean, imagine being that tattoo artist and he comes in and says,
"Oh my God,
give me old Tricky Dick's face on my..." Where was the tattoo?
It's literally right below his, like, it would almost appear as though it like peeks out of his neckline on his back. I don't think it's that high, but
bringing up that nickname for Richard Nixon just reminds me, and if we have any listeners that obviously early on in the podcast here, some local people that may have gone to high school with us and know Brian Race, the history government teacher at Boardman High School, introduced us to the nickname Tricky Dick for Richard Nixon. And he always said they called him Tricky Dick because he's tricky and his name is Richard.
So I think he's kind of this Republican hero at the time, but despite what we would think based on that, given today's standards, his accomplishments while he was in office would probably strike a lot of us as relatively moderate. He was instrumental in ending the war in Vietnam, as well as ending the military draft. He began diplomatic relations with China and gained the anti-ballistic missile treaty with the Soviet Union. And these following two were especially surprising to me. And that's that he enforced desegregation of Southern schools and established the EPA. Now, a note on the prior, the desegregation of Southern schools, and I guess a larger note on the political atmosphere at the time. We're used to this lineup of ideals and parties as kind of a Democrat with liberal urban centers and Republican with rural, a lot of Southern states. And at the time, it was almost flip-flopped. I mean, it's not an even divide. It wasn't exactly lined up as it is today, but the Democrats held what was called the Solid South. Of course, this is quite a bit later, but still the aftermath of the Republican Party of Abraham Lincoln. So you have these Southern Democrats which held control of the party till very late. In fact, I mean, Nixon was the first president to win all of the Southern states. I should say the first Republican president.
Initiatives and achievements, I mean, establishing the EPA and enforcing desegregation, they do seem like they would be more liberal democratic agenda points in today's political landscape. But, I mean, as you said, the parties were a little bit different.
Yeah.
At the time, and really, this isn't even that long ago. This is 50 years or so.
Yeah.
But, I mean, was Nixon popular across party lines, or was he more just popular with the Republicans?
I mean, he was pretty popular overall. He actually had one of the highest approval ratings with the public, topping out at around 67%, which was actually right before it plummeted during the scandal, but it hovered around 60% approval and 40% disapproval for most of his first term. And it's not to say that politics weren't divided then. I mean, they certainly were. In fact, many conservatives pointed to, and this is another theme that will kind of resonate with today's events. A lot of Republicans pointed out that they thought the Democratic Party used the Watergate scandal hyperbolically to attack Nixon and end his presidency. So it's not that the parties weren't divided necessarily, but compared to what we're used to, I suppose, during the last decade in American politics, I think he does, to me at least, come across as a pretty moderate. I'm not saying he's left-leaning in any way. I mean, some of the things I mentioned, I mean, I don't think diplomatic relations with China or ending a war are particularly partisan. Although, I guess for me at least, and this might be an uninformed point of view, I view the war in Vietnam as, and I suppose the push for the draft and the push for the war as a conservative ideal, given my view of today's conservative thought. And I kind of put the anti-war hippies into the liberal left, but I don't even know if that was true back then in the political realm.
I mean, when you talk about some of these not being partisan issues, it seems like pretty much everything can be a partisan issue today, one way or another. But even the idea of using scandals to force your political agenda, like that's all we see in today's politics, especially over the last 4 years. It seems like, not that our current president or outgoing president was, the cleanest of dudes, but every little thing was some different political scandal that was just manipulated as much as possible by the Democratic Party, just as a way to pitch him as the ultimate evil and worst, most corrupt president of all time. Regardless of your opinion on him, that's
right.
Just a political strategy, using scandals to turn public opinion.
Yeah, and I think that has gotten a lot more acceptable as of late. And I'm not even going to point directly to Trump. I think he kind of kicked the door in when it comes to that kind of behavior. But there were certainly other politicians on both sides of the aisle before him that were starting to, for lack of a better term, sling more shit than their predecessors did.
Yeah, and I mean, Obama had his share of quote unquote scandals, especially
the tan
jacket, whole Benghazi thing that was hung over Hillary's head when she was a presidential candidate, or George W. Bush was a walking, talking faux pas scandal, one thing after another with weapons of mass destruction and whatever we were doing over the Middle East. That's still a mess even today, but it's always been a thing. It's just, the last 4 years, it's really escalated from a president who knows how to manipulate these scandals, quote unquote scandals, to his benefit.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that's kind of the point I wanted to make in discussing a little bit of Nixon. And that's that while we can draw some comparisons between the two scandals, a lot was different back then. And, one of the things that we will definitely discuss later, but I think is pertinent to this, is that the Republican Party, Nixon's party, were the ones that, went to the White House and said, impeachment's inevitable, you should resign. And that's something I don't think that, I mean, it clearly didn't happen today in today's political climate. So it's just important, I guess, to remember that this was the setting, I suppose, for this scandal and its aftermath. So after his first term, which was a wildly successful first term, in addition to some of the other initiatives I mentioned, he also was the president to preside over the Apollo 11 moon landing, ending the space race. And that wasn't all his doing. I mean, it started before that race started before his administration, but to have presided over such a prominent moment in American history is an important thing.
Certainly a nice line on his presidential resume.
Oh, for sure. Right after the scandal and resignation.
Minor details.
So after this, he ended up winning his second term, which we'll discuss in a little bit more detail in the information about the scandal. But interestingly enough, he won his second term in one of the largest landslide victories in American history, the fourth largest ever.
So he was obviously an effective president. I mean, scandal or not, cheating or not, whatever went into this, you don't win that margin without, being perceived at least to some degree of effectiveness in the presidency.
Right. Well, I think, if you consider the time, he came at the end of this very turbulent era in American history. The ending of the Vietnam War and the end of the draft was a huge relief to so many Americans. And he was this kind of, like I said, he had these moderate, don't rock the boat necessarily policies that he almost, in addition to kind of being a more likable character, he didn't do a lot of things that upset an enormous amount of people. And I think that was why he was so popular, is that people were just tired of the rough and tumble, constant divide that had existed in the 1960s.
Now, was his victory more because of his success in his first term, or was he up against a bad candidate? What kind of led to this landslide?
I think in addition to being the incumbent, he had done a lot. Like I said, he was just this enormously popular middle of the road candidate. People weren't afraid of what he was going to do. I don't think George McGovern was a bad candidate necessarily, but he definitely, I think, was pretty solidly Democrat, and that pushed a lot of independents and Republicans against him. But I think another thing that played a part in this, and the approval ratings and their coinciding with different Watergate events, he was at a point in the Watergate scandal where he was kind of playing this innocent, honest guy. And I almost think, in a way, the beginning parts of the scandal, it not necessarily helped him, but certainly gained him favor in terms of, I suppose, his perceived honesty and his perceived willingness to work. Again, this is all a lie, as we would find out. But going into his November election, a lot of people had really high expectations and a really high regard for him, even despite the fact that a scandal was going on within his administration.
So I wanted to ask, and you may not know the answer to this, so maybe I should have saved it for the quiz at the end. But just to test your knowledge a little early here, which presidents had bigger election victories?
Oh, God.
Than
you should have said that. Would have been a good quiz question. I have no idea. I would.
One of them's obvious. Number one,
George Washington.
Obvious. Yeah, elected unanimously.
Yeah.
If you can name one of the other three that were above. If you can name one of the other three that were above Nixon, I'll give you a lot of credit here.
Would these include incumbents, I assume? Since, yes. I mean, this is an incumbent. I'm going to go ahead and guess FDR.
He was one of them.
Okay. I mean, that was an easier one. Beyond that, I have no idea.
Yeah, it was Ronald Reagan in 1984, FDR 1936, and James Monroe 1820. Just curious about that one, so I had to look it up. But
yeah,
your quiz questions at the end will be much harder.
Oh, great! So with the stage set in the Nixon presidency, we get to the winter and spring of 1972. Before we kind of start talking chronologically, as I've mentioned, this all started with this burglary of the Democratic National Committee's headquarters, which was located at the Watergate office building on the bank of the Potomac River in Washington, D.C. And then the Nixon administration's subsequent attempts to cover up and distance itself from this burglary are the main meat of what people refer to as the larger Watergate scandal.
So I want to just interject here with a huge pet peeve of mine. Now, obviously, most people know what Watergate is, even if they don't really understand it. They know it was a big scandal in American history. Mm-hmm. But have you noticed how many stupid, irrelevant scandals are now referred to as something gate?
Deflate.
Drives me crazy. Because, like, the implication there is that Watergate was something to do with water. And it's literally just the name of the building where this took place.
Oh, yeah.
But then you talk about, like, the Patriots and the NFL had their spy gate where they were stealing signs from the other team, and then later Deflate Gate when they were playing with deflated footballs. And then Trump accused Obama of his own spy gate where he was spying on his campaign that he later rebranded as Obama Gate. And there's so many other, you could look it up online, and there's hundreds, especially in the last 10 years or so, of these huge scandals that are something gate. And it all, like, the name comes from Watergate, but you would think that Watergate, and I bet the average American, not the average American, I bet there are a lot of Americans that think Watergate was some kind of scandal involving water.
I mean, that wouldn't surprise me. I didn't know that Watergate was the name of the office building before. I mean, I learned that probably 3 or 4 years ago, and I remember being kind of surprised at its popularity in, everyday speech. But what's interesting is it's actually not reserved for America. We made this word that international countries use. England uses gate. Israel, Egypt use gate. It's kind of interesting that other countries took this scandal and started using it.
It's just such a cliche, and it's not even used correctly, really. Like, gate has no significance to it, but now it's turned into this suffix to mean scandal.
Yeah.
And it just came from the name of this complex.
Well, and it's one of those things that I wouldn't be surprised the way, I think, even with technology and the internet affecting our linguistic culture, if gate ends up way down the road generations from now actually being a prefix to mean scandal, and nobody
probably
knows where
in
it comes
the Oxford
from.
Dictionary or something was added to it later on.
I mean, I wouldn't be surprised. So this Watergate scandal began with this burglary of the DNC headquarters, which was planned by this gentleman by the name of G. Gordon Liddy. He was part of this committee. He was the financial counsel for this committee named the Committee for the Re-election of the President. So I'm going to refer to this as the CRP for the rest of this episode, the Committee for the Re-election of the President, because I'm going to say it so many times that if I actually read the entire thing every time, you and all of our listeners are going to kill me. So
I saw some articles that actually shortened it to CREEP, as in Committee RE Election President CREEP.
That's great.
But that's probably not the official abbreviated version of it, so we can stick with CRP.
I remember reading that was kind of this tongue-in-cheek, satirical additional acronym given to it after all of this came out. But several months before the burglary in January, this gentleman, Gordon Liddy, presents this intelligence plan to several other members of the committee, including the acting chairman, Jeb Stuart Magruder, Attorney General John Mitchell, and the presidential counsel, John Dean. Now, I'm going to apologize up front for the sheer amount of names that are going to be in this. I even cut many out when we get to the cover up, but there were so many different names and titles that it was hard for me to keep it straight. So if you need a notebook, go ahead and grab one and write them down, because it does get pretty messy.
It's a good time to warn our listeners to buckle up, because this might be our longest episode yet.
Buckle up, get a drink, get some popcorn.
Skip ahead to the last 10 minutes just to hear the quiz, because that's probably the best section of our show.
Oh, then why did I do all this work? We could just do a quiz every week.
Oh, I'll quiz you. Hour and a half of just quizzing.
Great. So this guy, Gordon Liddy, presents this intelligence plan, and it involves a pretty extensive amount of illegal activities. And it's also estimated to cost about $1 million. So one of the three gentlemen he proposes it to, Attorney General John Mitchell, views it as unrealistic, both because of the extensive illegal activities involved and also the cost. But he ends up approving a reduced version, which still includes illegal activities.
The illegal activities that turn him away from it, or the cost?
Well, I mean, I think it's...
Because both of those surprised me from a government official.
Well, he does approve of this reduced version, which is half the cost. It's $500,000. And though it still includes an illegal attempt to burglarize the Democratic National Committee, to photograph campaign documents, and wiretap telephones, both of which are illegal, he does nix some of the other plans of the initial, what was called Operation Gemstone, which namely were to hold radical opposition leaders and kidnap them and hold them so that they can't interrupt the Republican National Convention. And also to provide prostitutes to politically weaken opposition leaders, which almost sounds like something that Borat would do. So
naturally, taxpayer-funded prostitutes. So clearly, it wasn't the illegality of this plan; it was just financially based.
Yeah,
Let's make sure our crimes stay within a budget.
So they move forward with a scaled-back plan to burglarize the DNC headquarters. And on May 28th, the first Watergate break-in begins. At the direction of Gordon Liddy and a gentleman by the name of Howard Hunt, who's a former CIA officer and also part of the CRP, James McCord, again, a former CIA officer and also the CRP's security coordinator, commits this burglary. So, to repeat, Gordon Liddy and Howard Hunt get this guy, James McCord, who was in the CIA with Hunt, to commit this burglary with a team, many of whom are actually of Cuban descent, but also include a former FBI agent, Alfred C. Baldwin III. And the names you probably need to remember because they're repeated are Hunt, McCord, and Baldwin. So this first burglary attempt ends in them successfully installing 2 listening devices. One for Robert Spencer Oliver, who's the executive director of the Association of State Democratic Chairmen. Essentially, this group works to boost and assist state representatives within the Democratic Party with the end goal of kind of elevating them to federal government positions later on. And then the DNC chairman, Larry O'Brien. So these are the 2 phones within the DNC that they decide to wiretap. The initial devices were successfully installed, but the team determined that a second break-in was necessary to perform repairs on O'Brien's phone. So,
Oops.
Yeah, so Oliver's works just fine. O'Brien's has something wrong with it, so they need to go back in. Not a great thing when you're committing burglary of a national headquarters, but it was during this second break-in that the Watergate security guard, Frank Wills, would assist in foiling their plans.
It's never the first time that you get caught. It's when you go back in, that's when things go wrong. Get it right the first time.
Yeah.
That was a lot to listen to so far, so why don't we give our listeners a quick break here before we get into the story about Frank Wills.
We'll be right back.
We just want to take a minute and thank you for listening to History's B-Side. You know, it takes a lot of time to research and put these episodes together, so we wanted to let you know how you can support the show going forward.
Go ahead and subscribe at anchor.fm/History's B-Side or wherever you're listening from. If you'd like, leave us a review and tell us what you think of our show.
If you're interested in advertising with the show and hearing your message in a spot like this, send us an email to historiesbside@gmail.com.
We're looking forward to hearing from you, and thanks for listening. All right, welcome back. So next we're going to get into the story of Frank Wills, his life, and then his actions on the evening of the burglary at the Watergate office complex. Frank Wills was born on February 4th in 1948 in Savannah, Georgia, and was primarily raised by his mother after his parents' separation. She ended up moving the family to North Augusta, South Carolina in 1953. He dropped out of high school in 11th grade and ended up studying heavy machine operations in Battle Creek, Michigan, where he earned his equivalency degree, which is essentially a GED from the Department of Labor's Job Corps. And this education allowed him to work in Detroit for the Ford plant on the assembly line and later for Chrysler Motors. But unfortunately, he'd be forced to leave this job due to his health issues, namely a severe case of asthma. So in 1971, following his leaving the auto industry, he traveled to Washington, D.C., working at a few hotels before becoming a security guard at the Watergate complex. And at the time of the break-in, Wills was only 24 years old. So a pretty young guy, pretty average guy. It's important to note, especially for later conversation, that a lot of his troubles earlier in life led him to have this kind of, it sounds a bit harsh, I suppose, but it's this almost world is against me and people expect me to fail attitude, which he did express in interviews, where he actually says, you know, people have dismissed me my whole life. Every time I fail, that's, I think, an important thing to take into account once we get to the aftermath of Watergate.
And he's a young guy who grew up in relative poverty.
Yeah.
Bounced around, obviously moved around a lot in his early life and is now at only 24 about to be unknowingly thrust into the middle of the biggest political scandal in American history.
Right. So he's a security guard at the Watergate complex. He makes about $80 a week at this point. I apologize for not knowing the inflation equivalent of that from then to now, but it was a pretty measly income.
It was a little under $500 a week.
Okay.
I believe. I'm not sure of that. That might be something to fact check us on, but
so not a rich man's salary. And he was also working the midnight shift from midnight to morning. And so he was kind of there all night by himself. He wasn't a particularly built guy. He was about 6 foot and only 155 pounds. And it was more comfortable doing model airplanes at home and cooking in his kitchen than he was, guarding an entire political office building. But, he took his job seriously. Despite that, I guess not despite that, but alongside that, the Watergate complex building was considered really secure. In fact, outside of the Watergate break-in, only one burglary had occurred outside of that in his first year of work. And so as a result of that, most guards only carried one can of mace and at times a nightstick.
You'd think the place that houses the DNC offices are probably pretty tight on security already.
Yeah.
You wouldn't expect the burglary to happen and only being watched by just a young night guard with not a lot of training or experience on his side.
Right. And that's another thing that kind of surprises me and leads to him unknowingly being thrust into this limelight. So one night, June 17th, 1972, 30 minutes after midnight, Wills is doing his rounds in the Watergate parking garage. And he notices duct tape covering the latch on the stairwell door leading from the garage into the building. This tape would essentially allow the doors to close, but prevented them from latching or locking.
So we know, obviously, that the tape was a part of their burglary plan.
Mm-hmm.
Would they have been in the middle of the burglary at this point, or this is just maybe some prep work that was done earlier in the day to get them ready to get into the building?
I don't know the exact timeline of their heist operations, but it's likely that this prior tape was part of prep work, just given when they were actually found in the building. But by the time it had been replaced, I think the burglary was already in process, because it was shortly after that the police would find the 5 burglars. So back to Wills, he finds this tape on the door. And he doesn't really think anything of it at first. He initially actually assumes that it was maintenance. I don't know exactly why maintenance would need to put tape on a door, but he assumes it was somebody else in the building that worked for the building. And he pretty much just rips it off and moves on with his night, soon going for his shift break. So at this point, he's clearly not that alarmed by its presence. He heads across the street to a restaurant in the Howard Johnson Motor Lodge. Ironically, this is the exact motel that McCord and Baldwin and their burglary team were staying in preparation for the crime. So he goes across the street to get takeout from this restaurant, comes back, and returns to his rounds. Interestingly enough, he wasn't supposed to go back down to the parking garage to check, but as he recalls it, he had this sixth sense that told him to go back and check the parking garage and the door. And so about an hour after he first discovers the tape on the door, he goes down and he notices it's been replaced. At this point, he feels that something is up. It's been replaced within an hour of him taking it off. It's in the middle of the night. Its placement, it's just fishy to him. But being a security guard alone in this office building with nothing but mace, he decides that if somebody's in the building, he probably can't handle it alone. So he calls the police to report what he says is a burglary in process. In fact, it's actually recorded in a security log, which is now stored at the National Archives. Wills wrote an entry in blue ink at 1:47 a.m., noting his call to the police to investigate this disturbance and mentioning the tape. So police arrive, and then in an interesting kind of funny anecdote, the police are plainclothes officers who were dressed as hippies, trying to work undercover. So these plainclothes hippie officers come in, and they find the 6th floor offices of the DNC ransacked.
I mean, why was the place trashed? Weren't they just supposed to go in to fix the wiretaps?
Well, they were, but as with the first mission, they also were there to photograph documents and collect information. So the ransacking of the place was most likely an attempt to find important information. So they weren't just there to fix this. I assume they figured we're going to be in there already. Let's get more info if we can.
And just trash the place.
What's interesting to me is there's not
suspicious at all.
Yeah, there's not a lot of attempts by the DNC to mention this in the first place. So I do wonder if they were a lot neater the first time they did it. You'd think Democratic National Committee headquarters would be pretty upset if their officers were completely trashed. But you don't really hear anything about this. So in another kind of funny anecdotal piece about the story, Alfred Baldwin, who was part of this burglary team with McCord, was stationed at the motel, the Howard Johnson, as a lookout. But unfortunately for them, he was distracted watching TV. And he had failed to notice both the arrival of the police as well as their discovery of the ransacked offices. And by the time he noticed any unusual activity on the 6th floor, it was too late. The police had entered the offices, they found the men, and expecting one man to put his hands up, were surprised when 5 separate men put their hands up from behind the desks they were hiding behind.
So, I mean, obviously Baldwin wasn't arrested with McCord and the rest of the 4 men there. At least not initially.
No.
I wonder what he was watching on TV at 1 a.m. in 1972. That saved him from getting arrested that night.
It's a wonderful life. So James McCord is arrested along with his 4 other associates, which allegedly were recruited by his associate Howard Hunt. And as I formerly mentioned, many of them were Cuban-born. Virgilio Gonzalez was a Cuban political activist and locksmith. Eugenio Martinez, again Cuban-born, was an anti-Castro activist. And Bernard Barker was a Cuban-born undercover CIA operative involved in plots to overthrow Fidel Castro. And these 3 men had a lot of connections to the CIA. Frank Sturgis, the one I haven't mentioned yet, who served in several branches of the military and as a CIA operative, was actually said to have met with the CIA director prior to the Kennedy assassination. And that's one of the conspiracy theories about the Kennedy assassination. So the CIA was kind of all over the place at this time. And many of these men were hired, essentially state-sanctioned criminals in a way, depending on what side of the coin you want to sit on. But they're hired for this job because of their skill set in connection to the CIA. And the police find these men carrying a lot of suspicious materials. They're carrying lockpicks, $2,300 in cash, which were in subsequent $100 bills by their serial number. They were carrying tear gas pens, 40 rolls of unexposed film, a police receiver to hear the police response, and wiretapping equipment. Why the police receiver didn't help them notice the police were on their way is beyond me, but...
I was going to say, a lot of these make sense. Obviously, lockpicks to get into the room. I guess tear gas pens if things really go wrong and you need, I don't know, a diversion or something.
Yeah.
The police receiver you'd think would have tipped them off, but they must not have been listening to it or using it. And then wiretapping equipment to fix it. I don't really understand the cash, and then obviously a lot of unexposed film.
Yeah, so I mean, I think the film was just needed to photograph the documents and information that they were looking for. Again, this entire campaign is an attempt to steal information, including the wiretapping. So as much as they can get, the better. They were looking for both things that could hurt the Democrats and also things they might have had on Nixon to use as weapons against him politically. The $2,300 in cash, I'm not entirely sure. If you want to take my humble opinion as a novice burglar trained by Grand Theft Auto 5, I can only assume that these men wanted some cash on hand. Should things go wrong, I mean, you're going to need some money to either escape or run or hide, and even bribe a nosy security guard if needed. That's all opinion.
I don't want to assign anything to, obviously, Frank Wills, but you'd think a young man who's been living in poverty most of his life probably wouldn't take too much of a bribe to get him to let these guys be on their way if he didn't have the cops along with him.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know his moral stance, And I don't know how much $2,300 in cash was at the time, but I mean, there's things I would have overlooked for a lot of money. I'm just being honest.
I mean, if he's making $500
$80 a week, yeah.
Well, yeah, $80 a week in that
Right.
time. So that's quite a bit more than he would have made in
Right.
even a, yeah.
So they get caught by the police. They're arrested. We skip to later that year in September. So this happened on June 17th. We're now in September on the 15th of 1972. A grand jury indicts these 5 men, along with Gordon Liddy, the planner, and Howard Hunt, for conspiracy, burglary, and violation of federal wiretapping laws. So these are the first 7 men in a long line of people arrested and charged for involvement in this. But that following January, these 7 men are tried by a jury on January 30th. And this is, interestingly enough, right after the Nixon re-election. And it's this trial that kind of flips a certain coin in the Nixon presidency. Because the 5 burglars either plead guilty or are convicted by the jury. And then Hunt and Liddy are later convicted. Hunt for burglary, conspiracy, and wiretapping, and Liddy for conspiracy, burglary, and refusing to testify before the Senate committee that was investigating Watergate. And this group of men pleading guilty and being convicted leads to a fair significant drop in Nixon's approval ratings.
So here's a thought experiment, I guess. We know, obviously, that during his second term, Nixon resigns from office. Spoiler alerts.
What?
At the time when Nixon gets reelected by this landslide victory, would this Watergate incident have been viewed as a success to some extent? Obviously, you don't want these people to get arrested and you don't want people to find out, but if the purpose was to gain campaign information from the DNC and it results in a massive election win for Nixon, did they accomplish their goals?
Well, I don't know. I don't even know if they needed it. That was one of the things I kept repeatedly thinking during this entire time is he had 60% approval rating. He was doing well, better than all but only 3 other candidates. If you look at the election numbers, and I don't know how much the media coverage of this helped him. I can't imagine it helped him enormously, and I don't know what they found that allowed them to trash McGovern, but I don't know why they needed to do this. That was the biggest thing for me is like, I would have to be in a pretty risky, dangerous political situation before I would be willing to break the law in this kind of way, I suppose. That would clearly, if I was caught, lead to an enormous downfall politically. It just baffles me why a president with a 60% approval, one of the highest approval ratings on average of any president, needed to perform espionage on his opponent.
There must be some motives that we're overlooking here.
Well, the one
reason why this took place.
The one thing that I was, learning about Nixon, kind of outside of the Watergate scandal, but more about him, is that he was a deeply paranoid man. There were the Pentagon Papers were coming out. He was very concerned about the media's interaction with him. In fact, during this cover-up, he would repeatedly attack the media, especially those who released stories that made him look not favorable. But he was very worried as a president about outside attack, and I think maybe that had something to do with it. I also don't, it never really comes out whether or not, this clearly wasn't his idea. It was Gordon Liddy's idea. So I don't know that Nixon was the one that woke up one night and was like, hey, we should do this. It was more the aftermath and the cover up of it that took him down. It was his being okay that it happened ended his political career.
So let's maybe get into some of the downward spiral of Nixon's political career.
Yeah, so all of this happens. The 7 men are convicted, which means that they're in the custody of the police and could talk to the police, uncovering, their associates and others involved, which puts a lot of Nixon aides who were involved and were knowing, including Nixon, in a precarious situation. So They initially appear publicly very innocent and unknowing about this entire thing. And he and his aides would go to, greater and greater lengths to distance themselves and cover up this scandal or this burglary and their connections to it. So the biggest initial connection is that the money used to perform the burglary was linked to CRP donations. And it was the committee to re-elect the president. So it was his campaign committee. So direct donations from random people to re-elect Nixon were then used to perform this burglary. And that they tried to hide this by using international bank accounts, but these efforts didn't really work. Initially,
maybe they should have had a different name for their committee that wasn't so obvious.
The committee to rob the DNC. So
and
this
is no way associated with the president, Richard Nixon.
Yeah, right.
What's the abbreviation on that?
It's too long. So this is the chronologically the earliest connection. The next thing that happens, and like I said, a lot of this scandal wasn't about the burglary. It was about attempts to cover it up. So the first thing that happens that's later uncovered when they release tapes from inside the White House is that the administration decides to pay hush money to indicted members of the burglary team. And they even went as far as to kidnap the wife of AG John Mitchell in fear of her making the connections back to Nixon. And this was done at her husband's direction. He directed her security detail to keep her from talking to the media. And they held her in a hotel room. And it was even noted that during an interview with United Press, she says, I'm leaving my husband until this is over. Until he resigns from the CRP. And at that moment in the interview, she just disappears because the security guard pulled the phone out of the hotel wall. She tried to escape several times off the balcony and was physically apprehended, injured, and was even given sedatives by a psychiatrist. So, I mean, not great. Like, not a great look.
I mean, they go to such great lengths to hide things from leaking out to the media at this time, which is, it's the early 70s. It's just traditional media that you're worried about. Imagine if social media existed during all this and like how quickly we know about all of today's modern scandals and whatnot that are just completely blown out of proportion because how quickly media, true and untrue, spreads and people blow things way out of proportion. But this is like real stuff. If that was uncovered in today's world, it would have been all over the place instantly. And
oh, absolutely.
I mean, it would have been the end of Nixon's presidency right there and then.
Yeah, I mean, the amount of information that was kept quiet for as long as it was kept quiet, I don't think would be possible today. And even people on the inside that were working with them would have had more opportunity to speak even anonymously than they did back then. So I think, this would have been uncovered a lot faster. But I do find it interesting that, and I might have already said this, so I'm repeating myself, but he was caught for trying to cover it up, not even for it. Like, they went to such extensive lengths to cover it up that they got caught for that. Like, it seems almost counterproductive. But, they're doing all of this to try to make it appear that the administration is separate from this group and that it's just this committee that decided to do this and it wasn't, they weren't involved. One of the first big breaks is due to Washington Post reporters Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein, who were working secretly with the deputy director of the FBI by the name of William Mark Felt Sr., also known by the code name Deep Throat. And he uncovered a lot of information to them, suggesting that knowledge of the break-in and the attempts to cover it up were part of this huge political sabotage campaign that reached into the upper ranks of the Justice Department, the FBI, the CIA, and, of course, the White House. Interestingly, the building that Woodward met Felt outside of actually has a plaque commemorating that location as their secret meeting spot. And the building was scheduled to be torn down, and the new building is actually going to have a similar memorial to the location. So moving on to later in this year, March of 1974, a grand jury indicts what's called the Watergate 7. And this is a group of top Nixon aides that were suspected of participating in a cover-up. Nixon is named as an unindicted co-conspirator, basically due to the fact that he's the president, and they don't believe they can indict a president at this point.
Sounds familiar.
Right? So then there's these tapes. This gentleman mentions that the White House has this new security system that records everything that is said in the Oval Office, the cabinet rooms, and several other offices. And so upon hearing of these tapes, the Senate subpoenas them, and eventually Nixon ends up releasing them. He tried 2 separate times to failure to get the special counsel that was requesting these tapes fired. Both AGs he requested to do that resigned in protest, and finally he got another official to fire Cox, and I haven't mentioned his name, but Archibald Cox was a special counsel that requested these tapes. And so he finally gets this man fired, only to have the tapes again be requested. So eventually these things are released.
Now, did Nixon know he was being recorded inside the White House?
I can't imagine he didn't. I mean, how could you be the president and not know there was a new security system that was recording everything? In fact, I mean, he did at least eventually, because they ended up editing them. These tapes are released, but only after they were, quote, edited for expletive language, which is, I mean, what is that, really? So, and
at that point, the president's corrupt, but you can't hear him say naughty words.
Right. Well, and they also name, issues of national security as something they edited out. But at that point, like, what are you getting out of these tapes if they got to edit stuff? So anyway, he ends up getting these tapes released, and at least initially the tape transcripts. Eventually the actual tapes are released, and these revealed some really critical information. On one tape, Nixon is heard approving of the plan to pay hush money to the burglars. He actually says, and I quote, "We have to pay them. That's just it. We have to pay it." Like, he just says, yeah, we have to pay them. And he also was heard discussing a plan to have the CIA interfere with the FBI's Watergate investigation. So this pretty much tattoos him to the attempts to cover it up, at least. Following the release of these tapes and their investigation, it's pretty much a certainty that Nixon's going to get impeached. It's not a certainty that he's going to get convicted and removed, but he's met by Republican Senate Minority Leader Hugh Scott and House Minority Leader John Jacob Rhodes, who inform him that this impeachment is inevitable. And faced with this, and with, at this point, public opinion firmly set against him, he issues his resignation.
You kind of wonder if, he would have been impeached for this, obviously. It just seems like that's the way it was heading, especially with Democrats controlling the House. Do you think he would have actually been convicted by the Senate and removed from office?
I don't.
We look at today's politics and there's so much partisan divide. I mean, did Nixon have enough Republican dissenters that they would have actually removed him from office for this?
I don't know. I don't, but I'm also coming from a place of relative cynicism when it comes to political moral backbones. But I think it is interesting that two Republican leaders on both sides of Congress met him to suggest resignation. I don't know if that, and I also don't know if at the time this kind of scandal was seen as something that you could just push your way through by not voting to, remove him from office. They might have all been worried, as I think a lot of people expected today's politicians to be, about their connection to this kind of, political behavior and criminal behavior.
Is it fair to give Nixon the benefit of the doubt in saying that his resignation was putting patriotism for the sanctity of the office of the presidency above his own political desires and his own ability to be in power?
I mean, I think
remain in power?
That's a hard question to answer, because I kind of put it on the spectrum where on one end you have what I think, and maybe, I mean, I'm not a politician. I'm not involved in politics. I certainly wouldn't survive if I were. But on one end, I have this idealistic place where, the putting the office first and patriotism would have been to not have done a lot of this in the first place. even if he didn't know about the burglary, let's assume that. I think in knowing about it, the proper thing, if you truly respect the enormity of the office and what it means in the Constitution and have the respect this country, I think, deserves from its leaders, the proper thing to have done would have been to just come out and say, these people did this, they're on my committee, like, I didn't know about it, whatever. Tell the truth. I think that's one end, though. That's this very idealistic idea I have of what I think people should do. Then on the other end of the spectrum, you have Donald Trump, who almost at every turn does the opposite of that. Like, I mean, he, even after I'd be like, well, you got to give it up now, you're caught, he's still like, nope, not caught, I didn't do it. Like, so, and I think Nixon's in the middle. Like, I don't think I think maybe we can give him credit for having the bigness to finally stand up and be like, yeah,
say it's over when it's over.
Yeah, it's over. So, I mean, there's a certain, I guess, dignity in that. But again, I think that respect is inflated in lieu of present times.
And maybe the sanctity for the office went out the window when he authorized this in the first place.
Yeah. I mean, that's, I guess, my view. And I don't even know that he himself authorized it. That's not something that's known. But I guess for me, a president who really respected the sanctity of office wouldn't be in the position to have to resign like this. But I suppose, in a way, put up against the aggregate politician, I respect him for finally doing the right thing. So he resigns, but it doesn't really lead. I mean, of course, his political life is over. He's lost public support, media support, and political support. But following his resignation, Congress drops the impeachment proceedings, allowing to keep his post-presidential, perks, and his successor, who was his vice president, Gerald Ford, unconditionally pardons him less than a month after his resignation in September, which guards him from any possible criminal charges. So, considering...
Sure, that was a real popular move with the public.
So, I mean, Gerald Ford didn't get reelected because, namely, a lot of people point to this. He served one term, and that was that. And a lot of people think it's because he did this. I'm sure other things factored in, but people weren't stoked that he pardoned him, especially this quickly in the way that he did. But the big point is he participates in all of this. Nixon participates in all of this corruption and this cover-up as the president of the United States, and doesn't really get punished in a lot of ways. I mean, yeah, he loses his status, but everybody who goes to jail loses their status if they have it, like, in addition to getting their punishment, their civil punishment. So the fact that he doesn't serve a day in prison and continues to keep his presidential perks until death is, I think, a pretty easy sentence. So this leads us to the aftermath for Frank Wills, which is the main reason. I know we've spent a lot of time talking about Watergate, and that's because it's a huge topic. And to be perfectly honest, I sped through a lot of this, and there's an enormous amount to read. So if, you guys have found this topic interesting, I definitely encourage you to go look it up, because there's a slew of information and details that I left out only in the interest of making Wills as much of the center of this episode as I could, because, we want to be...
This is history's B-side, not
yeah, exactly.
A-side.
Yeah.
If they want to hear about Watergate, they can do their own research, but we want to know about the people that were forgotten.
Yeah, and he has been by numerous accounts of the events, so I wanted to focus a little bit more on him. So he finds his tape. He's briefly regarded as a hero by the media because he's essentially the one who's responsible for uncovering this burglary plot, which leads to all of this other stuff. But pretty soon after the scandal ends, he fades from the headlines. He's able to give speeches here and there and interviews whenever the anniversary of Watergate comes around, but usually only for about $200 or less. Soon after, he ends up quitting his security job at the Watergate complex, citing his racist employer, and no promotion after his catching of the Watergate burglary. And he also complains about a measly $2.50 raise per week as reasons for his departure from his job. So in several different citations, he's, you know, I read about him speaking with pretty deep distaste and kind of an insulted air that, given his very influential actions during this time, he wasn't really given the, I think, attention and the respect that he deserves. And this is where I want to draw back to earlier in the episode when I said he has this kind of chip on his shoulder about a lot of events in his life, which may or may not be a fault to him, but he does kind of enter the equation already feeling like the world hasn't treated him fairly. And then this all happens, which only serves to kind of destroy his view of both American politics, of the media, and also his belief that people will give you just desserts for what you do. So after he quits his job, he does end up hiring an agent because he did participate in this huge historic event. And despite not being mentioned in the book All the President's Men, his agent does secure him an acting role in the movie, which was released in 1976. Despite this, there's still some controversy about the movie's portrayal of him, only in the weight he's given, because he's basically seen at the beginning of the movie for a couple seconds inspecting tape on a door and ripping it off, and that's the last you see of him in the entire movie. Now,
to be fair, that's about all of his contribution, the actual story of Watergate.
Right. That's totally what I was about to say. I mean, that's all he did. But I think, he returns to, and I think at least intellectually, philosophically, we have to return to the fact that if it were not for him noticing it, a lot of this may have not happened. So in addition to that slight, the Washington Post, who's one of the major media outlets reporting on this, completely leaves him out of the timeline of Watergate events. He's not even mentioned.
Do you think this had anything to do with race? I mean, earlier you mentioned about his employer being racist, and that's what led to him not getting raises and promotions.
Well, so, I think it's a hard question to answer, because I think at this point in time to say anything had nothing to do with race is a hard statement to make. I do think that he was a bit paranoid maybe about his treatment by others, but I also don't, I believe that he was mistreated in certain ways at this time because of his race. Like I said, we just came out of the civil rights era. There was still a lot of discrimination, and as there is now, but I don't know that necessarily this is why he was kept out. I don't know. It's a hard thing to say, because of course, none of the groups that wrote about it, none of the people that wrote about it mentioned that. That's kind of the hard thing about history, is that the winner writes the book.
Did his role in the story, was it big enough to warrant the kind of attention that he seems to think he deserved? Obviously, he led to the police arrival to catch the burglary, but you tend to think things sooner or later turn up, especially in this magnitude, that they eventually would have been caught for this burglary.
In my opinion, no. If you look at the Washington Post, they say it has nothing to do with race. If you look at civil rights groups, they say it has everything to do with race. I think everybody's a little bit right, but as objective as I can be, he did a great service, but he did his job. And I don't even know, if somebody wanted to give him a ton of airtime, did he find the tape that led to the burglary being discovered, that led to all this cover up? Totally. But that's the last thing he did. And if we're being pragmatic and realistic and all that about the way media works, it's you can only tell that story so many times. You can't write a book about it. I guess you could write an autobiography of Will's, but how many times
could somebody do an hour-long podcast about it without just talking about Watergate instead of him?
Well, right. Like that. I mean, that's a good point. I found it tremendously difficult to find enough information on him beyond stuff that was autobiographical to cover. And you know, I edited the outline for this podcast several times to try to reduce the coverage of Watergate overall to his airtime, because I didn't want to be, I mean, the point of doing him as a topic was to not slight his story, but I do think it's hard. I think it's a little bit of both. And I guess maybe that's a cop-out answer, but I think he expected too much and the world gave too little, and that just kind of blew up in his face.
Contributions were significant enough that he should be mentioned and his name should be told, especially in the, you know, highest reportings of the story, the Washington Post article and future books about it and stories and retellings. He's significant enough that he's a part of the story, but he's maybe not the main character. He's not going to be celebrated in the way that some of the other media coverage was, or the other government officials who actually, you know, did the research and charged the culprits with this burglary and the crimes that they committed.
Well, and the thing is, like, and maybe I should discuss the rest of his life before we discuss this further, because it is, I mean, I suppose it's important, but, you know, he believes that he was slighted from many jobs because people didn't want to hire him, fearing the loss of federal funding due to his status in foiling this, which, I mean, I think is kind of a twisted way to look at it. Again, I'm not an expert on the politics of the day. He was arrested twice for shoplifting, first for a 98-cent pen, for which he received a $108 fine, and then 3 years later for a $16 pair of tennis shoes, which he denies, saying he was hiding them for a man that was with him, but he faced up to a year in jail. Interestingly enough, he only served 3 weeks of this, so I again find a little bit of trouble drawing the drastic difference between him and the members of the burglary team or Nixon, because he got 3 weeks on a 1-year sentence. I don't know. It's hard to say whether he deserved that.
I mean, a hefty fine for a 98-cent pen seems like kind of petty.
Well, totally. I mean,
potentially a civil rights issue just because he was black, or is that maybe they were trying to get the guy who got the Watergate guys? Like, what? That just seems almost something you could easily dismiss as frivolous.
Yeah, I think it's way more likely that it was a civil rights race issue than it was a get the guy that got the Watergate guy issue. I don't buy that like local courts that would be handling this felt that strongly. I mean, maybe they did. Maybe there was like a Nixon fan sitting behind the desk in the courtroom. But, you know, I think a lot of this stuff is very hard to debate about because there's so little information on him. But I wanted to include it just as a backdrop against which to view the aftermath for others.
Right.
But to round this out, in 1984, him and, well, his girlfriend gives birth to their daughter, Angel, but unable to hold a steady job. He basically completely disappears from public radar. He stops doing these interviews and people forget his name. After his mother dies in 1992, he spends the final 8 years of his life in poverty before succumbing to a brain tumor on September 27, 2000. So definitely a pretty tragic, sad end to somebody that was pretty important in this tremendous event in history. But I think when you put him up against and compare him to a blank slate, I have trouble agreeing with some of his views. I think he's a bit paranoid and maybe expects too much out of what his accomplishments were. I think he certainly deserved to be given more credit as a security guard. And I don't know what the going rates were for raises during that time, but you know, as a security guard, I think he deserved a promotion and forward mobility in his career. That I think he absolutely deserved. I don't think he deserved to become an absolute celebrity. If I did something like that, a slew of TV interviews and maybe a book deal is what I would expect. But if all I did was remove tape from a door, I don't know what I would write about for an entire book. I think the troubling part for me, and this is still not even pragmatically troubling, just because this is kind of one of the unfair ways in which our world works, but more morally troubling, is that the people involved in the crime, in many cases, did better than he did. You know, Bob Woodward uncovered the crime, so I don't have any problem with him having several book deals and becoming a celebrity. But Nixon, at his time of death, was still worth $15 million. And that's, I mean, many presidents are vastly rich after they leave office or before they enter office. But even more, I guess, insulting to me is that a guy like Gordon Liddy, the planner of all of this, was able to write books. James McCord wrote books. A lot of the people involved in the cover-up wrote books and had media deals because of their involvement. That, yeah, they served prison time. Many of them served several years of prison time, but they still were able to leverage their involvement in a way that Frank Wills just wasn't.
Yeah, and you don't, obviously, it's not always good, but it's kind of just the way the world works.
Right. I mean, that's why
24-year-old impoverished security guard is never going to be remembered as well or be as successful as a former president, no matter how his presidency ended.
Yeah.
And it just seems like, I mean, we use the phrase that he was unknowingly thrust into the middle of the situation. He probably didn't expect the security guard job to turn into anything other than just a way to survive in his life at that point. And then this thing happens to him, and maybe in his own eyes, he hit the lottery. Like, this is his ticket out of that, and he can become someone just because of the circumstance that he lucked into, and he uncovered this thing that turned out to be massive. But really, I mean, it probably would have come to light whether or not he was involved or not. So it's great, and he can capitalize in the moment, but it's almost like we see now where people are just trying to get their 15 minutes of fame and then become something of that. But this isn't like a life-altering moment. This is a couple years altering moment at best.
Yeah, I mean, I tried to look at it as I'm comparing it to, I guess, an analogous situation, and maybe it's not perfect as a metaphor, but you know, if somebody breaks into my neighbor's house and robs him of all of his things, the burglar and my neighbor have books to write. If I'm the one that called the cops because I noticed a loud noise, maybe I get a spot on the local news, but like, I can't write a book about that. I'm not going to get invited to do a movie about me because I called the police. And you know, I think he certainly deserves credit in many of the ways that he's not been given it. But I think like I said before, his expectations as far as what this would do for his life were a bit lofty. But like, I mean, that being said, he certainly is, or should be regarded as a historical heroic figure that, like many heroic figures, were, you know, just doing their jobs at the time when their jobs needed them, and ended up becoming big parts of history as a result. And I mean, for a final point, because we could talk about this all night if we wanted to, I'm sure, but I think the biggest glaring disparity, at least morally, is that President Nixon, who participated in this deeply corrupt administration and political scandal, which has clearly involved several federal agencies, as media outlets would discover, and that had this decades-long impact on our political atmosphere, was essentially pardoned for crimes within a month of resigning for them. He was never indicted. He never paid a fine and never served a day in prison. You know, despite having his political life destroyed, like, he lived the rest of his life like an ex-president, while Frank Wills went on to basically be stonewalled by many businesses and was arrested twice for minor petty crimes. I mean, 98-cent pen and a $16 shoe, and he was put in prison, and then subsequently lived life in poverty.
Well, to kind of bring that back to our, you know, modern perspective on things, we questioned a little bit whether Nixon was deserving of being pardoned, and, you know, if President Ford was justified in issuing that pardon. Even today, I think we mentioned earlier, we're recording this on the last day of Trump's presidency. Tomorrow we'll have new President Biden, inaugurated. And in the final days of Trump's presidency, he's been impeached, and he's in the middle of facing charges for a crime that took place, or he was impeached for a crime that took place in the middle or near the end of his presidency while he was still in office. And I guess the question that I've been grappling with, and you hear this a lot in being discussed in media today, is it right to pursue legal penalties for a president after he leaves office? Because on the one hand, it's easy to say, yes, absolutely, we need to hold government officials accountable to make sure that these crimes aren't committed again. You know, you can't have what happened with Nixon's administration and the Watergate scandal being repeated and then the president able to just cover these things up. Or like what we saw with Trump's presidency the last couple of days, did he incite an insurrection that people can just take over the Capitol through force? And, you know, you need to hold these people accountable. But on the other hand, does it also denigrate the office of the presidency if as soon as they leave office, they're being thrown in prison or put on trial? And whether they're deserving of that or not, it also opens the door for, you know, political retaliation. It's different when it's, you know, Nixon's vice president who's of the same party and a close ally of Nixon issuing this pardon. But, you know, for Biden to immediately push for his predecessor to be convicted and face criminal charges, it kind of allows future presidents to take that step of trying to find ways to challenge their predecessor right after they get out of office.
Yeah, I mean, I see your point for sure. I certainly don't think it's the job of the president to bring these criminal charges. I do think, I mean, I have a lot more faith in our justice system than to believe that criminal charges could just be used as like a bat to whack your opponents with. I think, I mean, if somebody were to simply use something that was false or overblown as a retaliation tool, I like to think that our courts and our judges and our juries would respond in kind. And I have to say, as cynical as I generally am about our politicians and our government and their frequent inability to do what I deem to be a proper job, I am regularly impressed by the strength of our justice system and the courts. And there are a lot of problems for sure, but I don't know that I see it being reduced to what a scandal now is reduced to. You know, when the media is one thing, the courts are different. I think you can say anything and, you know, cancel culture, tear down somebody in the media, and that's fine. But
to that point, though, Ford didn't let that process play out. You know, Nixon never had to face the judicial system to decide whether or not a former president should face his crimes. The pardon just essentially wiped that clean for Nixon. He never had to, you know, face the music. And on the one hand, he doesn't allow the precedent for a president to then have his fate determined by the judicial system that we have in place. Or did he maybe set the precedent that presidents should not face criminal charges once they leave office because it just doesn't set a good look for what the presidency should be? And if that's the case, maybe Biden should pardon Trump in the spirit of, you know,
I so disagree.
Unity among the nation.
I mean, I think that the opposite is true too. To view the president as somebody outside the legal system, outside the code of law. Again, I think in a lot of ways, I respect presidents, and I think the presidency should be a position of humility and unity, and in a way, just another American. He's just another American, and I think to suggest that they should be immune to our laws for the rest of their lives is a dangerous. I mean, I think it's a dangerous path to walk down. I think maybe it is dangerous to use it as a political retaliation, but to set a precedent where every president is pardoned by his successor, I don't know. It creates, I think it creates a space for presidents to just go for it, just Hail Mary pass whatever the heck they want to try to do, because the successor will let them off.
I'm kind of glad you made that point, because when I was doing a little bit of my own research, I found this quote that I think is probably a good way to wrap up our story on Frank Wills. And he kind of agreed with you on how the president should be viewed when he leaves office. This was actually, I believe, from his obituary that was published in the New York Times. But it says, Interviewed by the Washington Star News on the day Nixon resigned, Mr. Wills said, quote, "We treat the president like a king when he should be a man for all the people." End quote. It's probably a good way to wrap up our story and, just remember the guy who's often forgotten in the story, the massive story that is Watergate.
Yeah. Thanks for bringing that to the table. I didn't see that anywhere, but it definitely is a good end cap.
Ready for your quiz?
Not quite, but let's do it.
All right, we'll be right back. All right, this has been a long episode so far, but we hope you're still tuned in and listening because, I don't know, I like these end quizzes that we do on our episodes, so hopefully you guys do as well. We do like to end every episode with just a short 3-question quiz to see how much today's host really studied in on his topic, and maybe you, the listener, know some of these and can answer along as we go. Are you ready, Matt?
As ready as I'm ever going to be.
I didn't want to make it too difficult, so there's not anything in depth about Watergate itself. It's going to be 1 sort of about the Nixon administration, and then 2 about Frank Wills.
Interestingly enough, I probably could have answered most of the Watergate questions, but let's do it.
So maybe it'll be more difficult. All right, we'll start with the Nixon administration. Well, this one does tie into Watergate. 2 of the Watergate burglars had connections to a group that Nixon established in 1971 to prevent leaks from coming out of the White House and to the press. What was the name of this group?
I don't know. I have to say I don't know.
I just thought this one was funny. They were the White House plumbers.
Dang it! Oh my God, I read about that yesterday night. I was trying to think of that so hard. Oh, that was a good question.
We're
going to have to edit that because I just screamed into the mic.
Prevent media leaks. But it was those 2 guys, their ties to the White House plumbers, which is what drew the suspicions from the FBI. All right, let's talk about Frank Wills. Following his Watergate fame, Frank Wills was briefly a spokesman for what products? This was one of his side jobs that he held, trying to capitalize a little bit on some of his fame from the incident.
I guess Mace.
No, you'll never get this. He was a spokesman for Dick Gregory's Fad Diet products.
What? Does that help you notice tape on doors? I don't understand.
Dick Gregory, if you're not familiar, was a political activist and comedian, and he was, pretty big on the fact that he was vegetarian and kind of used sort of his animal rights vegetarian side to promote these diet products. They were called the Slim Safe Bahamian Diet, and it was a weight loss powder. And actually, I looked it up. You can go on Amazon and buy some of his products today.
Ew, are they still good?
I have never tried it. Probably won't ever.
Yikes. I don't want to try
something. Are you saying I need to
70s.
lose weight?
No, I'm just saying.
That's rude.
What does diet powder taste like from the 1970s?
I think it said that you can mix it in with water or whatever liquid, and you just drink it 3 times a day to, I don't know if it's to supplement your meals or to replace your meals, but helps you lose weight apparently.
Ooh.
All right, your final question. You might get this one. This one I think is easier. Obviously, you mentioned Frank Wills portrayed himself in the 1976 film All the President's Men. He was also portrayed in name and voice only in what famous movie that came out in 1994? You're going to be mad when you hear it.
I probably am. Let me hear it.
Forrest Gump.
No. What? He was in Forrest Gump?
Gump meets President Nixon. They put him up in the Watergate Hotel, and he calls hotel security in the middle of the night because he sees flashlights shining in a neighboring room. And the man who answers the phone is the security guard who introduces himself as Frank Wills.
Oh, man. I need to watch Forrest Gump again.
when I saw it, I had to look up that scene because I was just surprised I heard his name. And obviously, you're watching the movie. If you don't know the story, you wouldn't get the reference.
Yeah, I mean, I guarantee you that the last time I watched Forrest Gump, which was a long time ago, that entire scene probably went over my head. I was just like, oh, he met President Nixon. Nice. And then, like, I would never have even made the connection to Watergate at that age. I mean, it was early high school.
I mean, he essentially tells Frank Wills, the security guard, to go check out this room because he sees all these flashlights and they're keeping him awake at night because they're just annoying Forrest Gump. But he sends the security guard up there to see what's going on.
Oh, man. I have to rewatch that movie.
Frank Wills catches the Watergate burglars.
I bet there's a lot more I would get now than the last time I watched it. Those are good quiz questions.
Thank you.
I didn't do well, but I'm so mad that I missed the White House.
You did a lot of other research.
All right. Well, as always, thank you guys for listening. We know this one has been a long one, but hopefully an interesting one for you. If you have any comments, questions, things to add in, please feel free to contact us at historiesbside@gmail.com. You can also find us on Facebook and Instagram, and we'll see you next week.
Thanks for listening.
History's B-Side is an independent, listener-supported podcast.
Leave us a review or subscribe to the show on your favorite podcasting service, and follow along on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram @History's B-Side.
Send us your feedback or inquire about sponsorship and advertising opportunities by emailing us at historiesbside@gmail.com.
You can support the show by visiting anchor.fm/historiesbside.
This episode was researched and produced by your hosts, Matt Melito
and Phil Hall. Thanks for listening to History's B-Side.